The present moment compels our attention to Attorney General Pam Bondi's appearance before the House Judiciary Committee on February 11, 2026, because it shows us something important about what happens when partisan loyalty collides with the fundamental requirements of democratic accountability. I have to confess, there's a sad kind of satisfaction in watching how this ends. The logic of appointing political allies to positions demanding institutional integrity has finally run into reality. The people who demanded transparency in the Epstein Files, who passed bipartisan legislation requiring their release, who placed victims in the hearing room as living witnesses, they received not answers but theatrics. Let me paint you the picture of what happened over 5 excruciating hours last Tuesday. That's the Rayburn House office building on Capitol Hill, one of the most consequential places in America, where cabinet officials are supposed to demonstrate that they serve the American people, not just the president who appointed them. Attorney General Bondi sat before the House Judiciary Committee, flanked by DOJ officials, with Jeffrey Epstein's victims seated directly behind her. These survivors had traveled to Washington seeking acknowledgement, seeking justice, seeking at minimum a simple apology for the Justice Department's botched handling of documents that exposed their identities to public scrutiny. They weren't Republicans, they weren't conservatives, these were citizens who believed that the nation's chief law enforcement officer might show them basic human decency. And wouldn't you know it, what they witnessed instead was absolutely one of the most combative congressional hearings in recent memory, a spectacle in which the Attorney General called members of Congress washed-up loser lawyers, accused questioners of theatrics, and refused to answer 15 substantive questions about the Epstein investigation. When Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington asked whether Bondi would turn around and apologize to the victims seated behind her, the Attorney General declined. When pressed repeatedly, Bondi accused Jayapal of staging a performance. The survivors, raised their hands when asked if any DOJ official had bothered to meet with them. Every single hand went up. 0 meetings. Absolutely 0 empathy. Before the guardians of charitable interpretation protest, permit me to stipulate congressional hearings have become increasingly theatrical on both sides of the aisle. This, however, is peripheral to my central argument. The essential point is that we're witnessing the degradation of a constitutional office. What lends this episode its singular piquancy is this: Bondi's outbursts, her name-calling, her refusal to answer basic prosecutorial questions. This is merely the superstructure. The foundation rests upon something far more consequential. The Attorney General of the United States demonstrated on national television that she lacks either the temperament or the independence to fulfill the obligations of her office. Let us proceed methodically, for this constitutes a veritable textbook case of institutional capture. The Attorney General arrived at the hearing with what members described as a burn book, opposition research on Democratic committee members. Think about that for a moment. Instead of preparing answers about DOJ policy, about the status of criminal investigations, about why the department released files with victims' names inadequately redacted, Bondi brought political ammunition. The chronology matters here. In November 2025, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act with bipartisan support. The law required the Justice Department to publish all documents related to Jeffrey Epstein in an easily searchable format, with limited redactions permitted only to protect victims' identities. By January 2026, the DOJ began releasing files, but with heavy redactions that appeared designed not to protect victims, but to shield powerful men in Epstein's orbit. Names like Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate, were blacked out in FBI documents listing potential co-conspirators. When Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky who championed the transparency law, caught the redaction during the hearing, Bondi claimed DOJ unredacted Wexner's name within 40 minutes. 40 minutes of me catching you red-handed, Massie replied. You know what's absolutely revealing about this? Massie isn't some progressive Democrat with an axe to grind. He's a libertarian-minded conservative who worked with Democrats to force transparency. In Bondi's response, she called him a man with Trump derangement syndrome and attacked his vote on an unrelated artificial intelligence bill. When institutional rot reaches the point where the Attorney General attacks members of her own party for demanding legal compliance, we've crossed a threshold. As James Madison observed in Federalist No. 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The founders designed our system with the understanding that power concentrates and corrupts. They created institutional checks specifically so that attorneys general would serve justice, not presidents. The entire constitutional architecture rests on this principle. But what happens when an official views accountability questions as partisan attacks? What happens when oversight becomes theatrics in the official's mind? The plot, as the bard would say, thickens. Throughout the hearing, Bondi refused to answer how many of Epstein's alleged co-conspirators the DOJ has indicted. The answer, according to Democratic committee staff, is 0. She refused to answer why DOJ hasn't questioned Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick about his ties to Epstein. She refused to answer whether Prince Andrew, shown in disturbing photos in the Epstein Files, merits investigation. She refused to answer whether she'd consider recommending a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell, currently serving 20 years for sex trafficking. 15 substantive questions, 15 refusals. Look, in baseball terms, that's not just striking out, that's refusing to step up to the plate. When George Will writes about baseball, he often notes that the sport reveals character through repeated trials. A 300 hitter fails 7 times out of 10, but he keeps swinging. Bondi didn't even swing. She stood at the plate and argued with the umpire about whether baseball should exist. The contradiction is stark. Is the Justice Department an independent institution bound by law and congressional oversight, or is it an instrument of executive power that answers only to the president? It cannot be both, yet Bondi asserted it to be. When Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland, a former constitutional law professor, accused her of running a massive Epstein cover-up, Bondi shot back, "You don't tell me anything, you washed-up loser lawyer, you're not even a lawyer." These are the precise words, preserved for posterity in the congressional record and multiple video recordings. A sitting attorney general under oath before Congress, calling a distinguished member of that body a washed-up loser. The dignity of the office evaporated in that moment. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas walked out of the hearing after telling Bondi she would be remembered as one of the worst attorneys general. Representative Becca Balint of Vermont confronted Bondi about anti-Semitism, revealing that her grandfather died in the Holocaust. Multiple Democratic members accused Bondi of prioritizing loyalty to Donald Trump over the rule of law. And through it all, Bondi grew more combative, more defensive, more openly contemptuous of the oversight process. A penetrating analysis in the New York Times drew an instructive parallel between Bondi's performance and that of recent attorneys general, who similarly blurred the line between presidential loyalty and institutional independence. But even in that troubled history, we rarely witness such open hostility to Congress itself. Quantified approval ratings for DOJ credibility have reached historic lows, though precise polling wasn't yet available as of this writing. Such depths of public confidence in the Justice Department are rarely plumbed, and we're absolutely witnessing it happen in real time. The victims who attended the hearing told reporters afterward that they felt dismissed, insulted, and re-victimized by Bondi's refusal to acknowledge their suffering. Danielle Bensky, who met Epstein in 2004 when she was 17 and has accused him of sexual assault, told NBC, "There was such a lack of empathy today. There was such a lack of, honestly, humanity today. When the people you're supposed to protect describe you as lacking humanity, you know that's not a partisan talking point. That's a failure of the most basic requirement of the office." The judicious observer might interject, "Surely committee Democrats engaged in grandstanding. Surely Bondi faced unfair questioning designed more to generate viral video clips than to elicit information. And indeed, there is merit in this contention. Am I relieved that Congress takes the Epstein matter seriously, that survivors finally have a platform, that both parties initially demanded transparency? Indubitably. Yet this misses the essential point. The matter at hand is not whether Democrats asked tough questions. Of course they did. The matter is how the nation's chief law enforcement officer responded. She could have demonstrated grace under pressure. She could have answered the questions she was able to answer and respectfully declined to discuss ongoing investigations. She could have, at absolute minimum, turned around and offered a simple, direct apology to the victims seated behind her. She did none of these things. The fundamental error, one that conservatives have identified since Edmund Burke's critique of revolutionary excess, is the assumption that personal loyalty to a leader can substitute for institutional integrity. One may promise decisive action, bold reform, and loyalty to the people, But governance requires respect for established norms, procedural regularity, and the separation of powers. From Weimar Germany in the 1930s to contemporary examples of democratic backsliding around the world, the pattern recurs with Newtonian regularity. When officials view oversight as obstruction, when they attack questioners rather than answer questions, when they prize loyalty to the executive over fidelity to law, democratic institutions erode. The catastrophes vary in magnitude, from the extreme example of complete institutional collapse to the gradual example of declining public trust. Yet the terminus is invariant. You end up with a system where power, not law, determines outcomes. This is absolutely not a partisan observation. Conservative legal scholars have long argued that the rule of law requires institutional independence precisely because human beings, given unchecked power, will abuse it. That's why we have an attorney general who supposedly serves the Constitution, not the president's personal interests. That's why congressional oversight exists. That's why the founders created 3 separate branches of government. I return to those Epstein survivors seated in the Rayburn building, for these citizens grasp something vital, however imperfectly they might articulate it. They understand that justice requires institutions that function above politics, that treat victims with dignity, that pursue wrongdoing regardless of who might be implicated. Their diagnosis of what happened Tuesday is absolutely correct. They were disrespected and dismissed. Their hope, however, errs. They attribute the failure to this particular attorney general's temperament and loyalty to Trump. The malady is more systemic. The defect lies not in Pam Bondi's personality, but in the fundamental incentive structure that rewards partisan loyalty over institutional integrity. Until we demand that attorneys general serve justice rather than presidents, until we hold them accountable for basic competence and decorum, until we insist that congressional oversight means something, we'll continue witnessing these degrading spectacles. The survivors and their advocates should discern that the problem runs deeper than one contentious hearing, that the solution requires rebuilding institutional norms, that this will take longer than one election cycle. But historical determinism suggests otherwise. They shall seek another champion, pin their hopes on the next administration, and expect different results, and the cycle will perpetuate itself with tragic irony. Because we've forgotten that republics require more than good intentions, they require institutions we respect even when we disagree with their conclusions. They require officials who understand that the office is bigger than their ego. They require, above all, the capacity to say, "I'm sorry," to victims who deserve far better than they received on February 11, 2026. That Pam Bondi couldn't manage even that small grace tells you everything you need to know about where we are and how far we've fallen.